Okay, all right, great. I think we are ready to start out here. My name is Jeannie Kildee. I'm the director of the Religious Studies program here at the University of Minnesota, and it was our privilege to work with Twin Cities Public Television on the program that you just saw. I want to give you a little bit of background on how the program developed, how it came to be, and then I'm going to introduce our three of our people who, as you saw just now, participated in it to talk briefly about their experience, and then we basically want to open it up for questions and conversation and discussion. The whole program was conceived as a conversation starter. And thus, this is a great opportunity for us to test that capability. I also want to mention, as we start out, that free copies of the DVD will be available in the near future. We're in the process of getting those copies made. If you'd like one, you can contact me at our website, the Religious Studies website, rels@umn.edu. We do have some funding to mail out copies, so if we get your request early on, it'll be completely free. If we get your request in a couple months, we might have to charge you postage, but there are copies available. So it was during the spring of 2010 that word came that the National Endowment of the Humanities had a new initiative called Bridging Cultures, and one track of that initiative was called the Muslim World and the Humanities. The Religious Studies program, which is an interdepartmental program, we draw upon faculty from many departments, was in a really excellent position, along with the Institute for Global Studies, to bring together a group of faculty from the University of Minnesota, all of whom focus, faculty and graduate students, all of whom focus on the study of Islam in some form or fashion. The NEH wanted to bring scholarly work to the broader community. So the NEH request for proposals had a very strong public engagement element in it. In fact, what they said they wanted the proposals to do was to combine some sort of a scholarly forum with a strong public engagement component, and that's what we ultimately came up with. That group of faculty, over a dozen faculty in those meetings, ultimately brought together a proposal, and led by Nabil Matar on my left, myself, and Bill Beeman in the anthropology department. And we were ably assisted in developing that proposal by Alexandra Brown, who was helped out with the grant writing piece of it. We developed a proposal that included a scholarly conference that intended to bring in faculty from around the country that would be open to the public and geared for the public as well. I'm getting a little back feed here. In addition to the scholarly conference, which focused on the humanistic production in the Muslim world, both historically and currently, we included now I'm complete. Am I still on? We included a community engagement element that would foster dialogue on the subject between academia and the public. We included the development of a play based on a 12th century philosophical novel, Hayy ibn Yaqzan, by an Islamic writer, and this television program, obviously, geared for a broad public. We received about $170,000 for the entire project from the NEH. The conference occurred in February of 2011. It was really quite successful. It was capped off at the end by an appearance by 5th District Congressman Keith Ellison, who came to it as well, along with many community members, many students in religious studies, some of whom were volunteers during the conference and did a great job of that, and faculty and graduate students from the university. The television program piece of it came about in part through the conference. TPT executive in charge, as he was called, Tom Trow, and producer Steve Spencer interviewed all of the out-of-town guests during the conference, and many of the speakers that you saw in the film were those folks who delivered papers. They interviewed them, and then after the conference, they put together, Tom and Steve put together this program for a public audience, for airing on the Minnesota channel. After the conference, they later interviewed Nabil, Catherine Asher, and Nahid Khan to fill in some of the sort of intellectual and historical context, to fill in the local pieces as well with the Minneapolis Institute of Art and then the local culture here in Minneapolis. So it was really a TPT production in many ways, and the program has aired on the Minnesota channel fairly regularly since last November. Our goal, again, was to create something that was a conversation starter, something that could be used in high school classes, college classes, to give a little bit of information and then get the conversation going. On the DVD, full interviews with the individuals that you saw in the film are included, so the DVD has more information than just the program. So as a conversation starter, I'm happy to introduce our panelists then, and we will open it up to conversation here. Our first panelist is Professor of English Nabil Matar, who, as I said, provided much of the intellectual grounding for the entire project. His research and writing focus on the 16th and 17th century interactions between Europe and especially England and the world of Islam. Since our Bridging Cultures project, he has continued to work with NEH to some extent. More recently, we're happy to say he has received the 2012 Building Bridges Award, too many bridges, from the Association of Muslim Social Scientists for his pioneering scholarship on the relationship between Islamic civilization and early modern Europe, which has helped raise awareness of the historical roots of Western perceptions of Islam. Our second panelist is art history professor Catherine Asher. Catherine is a specialist in Islamic and Indian art from around 1200 to the present. She's done much work on the Mughal dynasty and increasingly is working on the patronage of their successors and predecessors, both Muslim and non-Muslim. Her current work focuses on architecture, painting, and luxury arts of Hindus, Jains, Muslim Sikhs in cities across northern India. And our third panelist is Nahid Khan. Nahid is a PhD candidate in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication. She's just finishing her dissertation on the reception of the U.S. Postal Service's Eid stamp, which was first issued on August 1st, 2001. Nahid did much of the heavy lifting on the conference. She served as our graduate assistant through the whole thing, developing relationships with various communities and taking care of much of the day-to-day work on the conference itself. So each of our panelists is going to talk briefly, and then, as I say, we're going to open it up for conversation. So, Nabil?
Well, thank you, Jeannie. I'll just talk about how the kind of project came together. I mean, when we met at the initial gathering of the few academics who attended it, we were just trying to think, what kind of approach to have. And our idea was that we wanted to show the world through Islamic eyes, and basically to focus within those eyes, to focus on one theme, the theme of knowledge. The word ilm is a very important word in Arabic because it's kind of comprehensive in terms of science and humanities. And although our keynote speaker at the beginning was basically focusing on humanities as such, that was exactly the point that came across, is that it's a much broader perspective than just kind of dividing it between science and liberal arts and other factors. So we were focusing, and we wanted to find some kind of umbrella for, covering really three angles. One angle was we wanted this to be multidisciplinary. We wanted to have as many disciplines kind of presented within the range of Islamic ilm as we could. And obviously, as you saw in the film, we had architecture, we had cosmology, we had philosophy, we had kind of reflection on theology. So in a sense, we tried to involve as many disciplines as we could. So that was the first angle which we aimed at getting, painting, art and other aspects as well. The second was geography, because obviously we often speak about the Islamic world, and this is a huge world. And as you saw on the map, I mean, from Morocco to India, at least in the period we're looking at. So how do we kind of try to cover as wide a range as was possible in terms of this kind of vast world of the Islamic communities? And third was also in terms of time. I mean, we didn't want this to be just a historical document of kind of medieval Islam or early modern Islam or whatever. We wanted it to be, again, kind of to cross across centuries. And so basically from as far back as we could start until, as you could see, the contemporary scene. So in a sense, from kind of the Andalusian phase in Spain until, as you saw in Doha, and contemporary paintings from Iran. So, I mean, these were the three angles we wanted to focus on. But we also wanted to have some kind of text that provides a directive. And it's kind of interesting because it was a text I was working on in terms of its translations. And then when we were having discussion during that meeting with Professor Beamel, he mentioned that, he has a friend who's working on a play about this 12th century kind of text, and it was exactly the text I was working on. So it was really a wonderful occasion, but purely, just happened that the two of us kind of started talking about that, and we thought this was a text that could really give a kind of a framework to the whole. It's a wonderful kind of philosophical text of medieval mysticism, written by a Muslim jurist, physician, theologian. I mean, basically Muslim kind of thinkers in the medieval period were polymaths. I mean, there would be theologians as well as scientists, as well as jurists, as well as mathematicians. In his case, he was also a scientist, he was also a physician, a surgeon as well. So, and he, of all his writings, basically only this particular text has survived. It's a story of a kind of a child, born on an island, and how he grows to find, through intellectual development, basically Aristotelian kind of modes of thinking, how he discovers, the oneness of God, the oneness of the unmoved mover, as he calls him. And so that was kind of in the text. And it was also a text, by the way, which is very interesting, because for many historians and critics, they recognize a very clear marker in terms of its influence on Robinson Crusoe. That Daniel Defoe in the beginning of the 18th century must have read the numerous translations of this text from Arabic into Latin and then into English in the second half of the 17th century. So it was a text that really kind of fulfilled our kind of purposes from all perspectives. So this is what we kind of basically set as our motif, the world of knowledge, and in a sense the variety of knowledge that we could explore under the rubric of this text of a man who lived in Cordoba, kind of end of the 12th century, wrote this, as far as we know, this solitary text, and yet a text with tremendous both Arabic, Islamic, and international impact. I think, the one aspect that I really enjoyed, this was a wonderful occasion. It was really a very, very successful set of meetings, and it was a lot of hard work, but now I was telling Jeannie, now that we think back on it a year ago, it was really a wonderful experience, much as at the time we were all overwhelmed by it. But I think the one aspect that I really, and I never anticipated that, is that, we had a lot of students who participated, who kind of attended. Often we told them they had to go, so they did come. And then we asked them to write a report, and actually one of them is in the audience right now. And what was very interesting to me is something, as I say, totally unexpected, is how much the students enjoyed the kind of dialogue that, we had among each other as community, as professors, as students. And we sometimes had very, very heated discussions. I mean, these were not just always kind of civilized and polite. Well, they were civilized, but in a sense, they were intense discussions. I mean, there were disagreements, and that was wonderful. And I think what I really enjoyed in the reports I read, and I had a large class and therefore kind of quite a number of students there, is how much they enjoyed seeing, the kind of discussion, the kind of intellectual, disputation that goes on among academics, not just, as we teach in class, as we write our books in our solitude, but really that there is an intellectual life that is very, very active, and in which, as I say, they were extremely engaged.
Absolutely.
I can just pick up where Nubble ended, and that is that I too had a fairly large class that attended the conference, and I also was very pleased with how engaged many of them became, and in particular seeing the play. I had a number of students who'd actually never seen a play before, and so this was in and of itself exciting to think that. I've always thought that bringing them to the MIA is something, as many of them have never been to the MIA, and in fact I took a group of students recently who wouldn't believe me that these were original works of art and not scanned images. So it's always an eye-opener, okay? But that said, and how exciting that was, what I'd like to do is go back to the film itself and then sort of go beyond the film. And I'm going to start off by saying that this film keeps getting shorter. Every time somebody tells it to me, I've heard it's 30 minutes, then it went down to 29, then to 28, now it's 27. I don't know what it really is. But whatever it really is in, I think it's quite an accomplishment that so much ground could be covered in that short period of time that went from the business of scientific inquiry from at least the 12th century, if not much earlier, on and engaging in the visual arts as well, and then going well into the 20th and 21st century. I thought that was quite remarkable on the part of, I think we should really credit Tom Troe with doing much of that. So what I would like to do at this point is say that my part of the film engaged basically talking about three very specific works. We actually did more, but that's what ended up in the film. And all of those works would date to what we would call basically the pre-modern or the very early modern part of sort of a historical framework or historical period. Near the end of the film, though, we had two people who had originally been part of our conference that were discussing modern contemporary architecture and painting. And this is where I would like to make a few comments and perhaps open up the floor for discussion at the end. And that is that Nadir Ardalan mostly focused on what he saw as a rather sad state of affairs. For example, the constructions of ultra-modern, unrealistic cities in places like Qatar, Doha, Bahrain, places like that, which is true. They certainly do exist, and I can remember the first time I went to Qatar, I was kind of in a state of shock. I couldn't imagine what those buildings were for, and I still to this day can't figure out who used them. But there's also another side of the story that I think is really important to tell, and that is that in the year 1979, the Aga Khan, who is the spiritual leader of a certain sect of Muslims, but also a very wealthy and philanthropist, established an award for what he called Islamic architecture. And the whole goal of this award was basically to find an architectural expression that was culturally relevant and also fit with the environmental needs of the geographical area in which this award was given. This award is given every 3 years. It's on a 3-year cycle. It's given in a number of categories. And while it bears the name, the Islamic Award, the Aga Khan Award for Islamic Architecture, in fact, it really does not necessarily just apply to Islamic architecture. For example, in a certain city in India, a very successful slum revival project recently won the award, and that city had remarkably little to do with Muslims. The point that I'm trying to make here is that while it's true that there is one side of the coin where we see basically irresponsible city building and architecture, there's another very, very, very relevant part of that coin, and I'd like that to be sort of on the table and for you to be aware of this. The other thing that picks up from the film is the discussion of contemporary and modern art. Susan Babai was mostly speaking about Middle Eastern art, but we can extend that to any art that has to do with sort of an Islamic contemporary context. And again, here I'm going to focus largely on students, and that is that while I am basically trained as an early modernist, my students want me to teach contemporary Muslim art and architecture. And so to meet that demand, I do it. So there certainly is a great interest, and there's in a response to it. And I know that this is true across universities and colleges in North America. This is not just a University of Minnesota phenomena. So this is sort of maybe to open the door for later discussion.
Oh, hello everyone. I'm Nahid Khan, and I wrote up a little speech in case I was tongue-tied, and I'm going to be needing my reading glasses as well, because even though I printed it out in 14-point, I still need my reading glasses. When I started grad school, I could read without reading glasses, 9 or 8 point, and I still remember a professor, I turned in a paper in 8 point, and she just looked at me and said, I can't read that, and I couldn't understand that. That just never, didn't mean anything to me, but here I am now with reading glasses. Okay. As a graduate student in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, minoring both religious studies and museum studies, my academic interests focus on the study of American news coverage of American Muslims as part of a larger interest studying agenda building and implementation for and of diversity in the nation's institutions, which, as it turns out, is an underlying theme in news coverage during the past 40 or so years. But on the side, as a volunteer in many community organizations, I've had the chance to observe and participate in this process in a very small way. And these community connections were helpful in supporting the work of the year-long NEH-funded project, Shared Cultural Spaces, Islam in the West and the Arts and Sciences, for which I served as the graduate assistant and organizer. My participation in the project began beforehand when a group of faculty members gathered in the spring of 2010 to discuss applying for the grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities under its program entitled Bridging Cultures, the Muslim World and the Humanities. And as it happened, I was TAing that semester for Jeannie's Theory and Method in Religious Studies course. So of course we had many deep conversations, not just about the course itself, but about curriculum, campus, and community connections. We talked about the U of M's many academic resources for advancing awareness about Minnesota and American Muslims, the contemporary Muslim world, and the history of Muslim civilizations. We talked about these resources being not just for students and scholars, but being of high interest to the general public. In particular, members of local Muslim communities, professional staff at area cultural institutions, and people involved in the work of various community organizations, especially in the area of interfaith and interreligious understanding, the arts, and also social justice and peace activism to advance knowledge and relationships connected to a variety of religious, cultural, social, and political topics. So I was invited to participate in the meetings about this project, and I got to see that all the faculty members interested in this project had interests in all these topics and various community connections that eventually played a role in winning the grant and then helping to carry out the work of the grant. My particular role, beyond the usual work that might be expected from a graduate assistant for this project, was to help reach some key community institutions to commit to being community sponsors for the grant. As a longtime member of the Islamic Center of Minnesota, which began in 1968 as an offshoot of the Muslim Students Association here at the University of Minnesota, I was able to enlist their support. I'm also the longest continuing board member of MISNA, which is a Twin Cities-based Arab American arts organization, so I was able to obtain their sponsorship as well. And as a collection and focus guide and former intern as part of my museum studies minor at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, I was able to get a great commitment from this institution as well. And I hereby acknowledge that their staff gave this project a tremendous level of support throughout the year's programming, quite aside from this television program, for which all of us are most grateful. Now, I can't take any credit for obtaining TPT's involvement, even though I'm in journalism and mass communication. This was arranged by other grant writers, and the main person involved in producing the program, Tom Troe, has a very long association with the University of Minnesota. He was on the staff here for many years as well. So other people were responsible there. But this program certainly plays a key role in distilling and highlighting the major themes of the project, having to do with connections and overlaps between the Muslim world and the Western world. It takes educational, cultural engagement to the next level beyond the insights that came from the academic conference, play, and museum tour that were the centerpiece of the year-long project on shared cultural spaces. These activities obviously were intellectually and academically focused, and certainly credit Nabil for his leadership there. And while we did a great deal of on-campus outreach to invite all of our own diverse students, faculty, and staff, we put a lot of effort into our community outreach, both through our community sponsors as well as through subsequent invitations to other cultural organizations and institutions. And I think you can probably go to our website for the conference to get a lot of details about who was involved, but it was quite a few. These included members of many local Muslim organizations, whether you define them religiously or ethnically, members of arts organizations, as well as peace, activist, and social justice organizations, people involved in various forms of interfaith dialogue programming, various educators at all levels, and professional staff at the various local museums and cultural institutions. So in a sense, this outreach was an outcome of many discussions well beforehand with Jeannie, as I mentioned earlier. And so the sheer variety of those who turned out for all our events resulted in many productive interchanges and interactions between our diverse attendees, as Kathy and Nabil have mentioned, and also much useful feedback from our audience surveys. And because we made an effort to go beyond the usual campus-based audience to reach those in the community who might be the most interested in this project, we also reached the types of people who tend to be amongst the main audiences for TPT programming. So beyond our attendees benefiting from the content of our shared cultural spaces, conference, play, and museum tour, we benefited from learning about their interests. One of these focused on the basic international premise of our project and what it meant to our Minnesota audience, which had some implications for this TPT program. The idea of bridging cultures, especially when it came to the topic of Islam in the West, tends to suggest that Islam and Muslims are outside the notion of the West, and that in this context, bridging cultures means talking about ways to link two separate civilizations. As an interviewee, I wanted to help support the program's ultimate goal of overcoming some of that thinking by showing not just some of the connections, but some of the overlaps, the sharedness that the year-long project entitled Shared Cultural Spaces was all about. For me, the program's reliance on local resources for understanding and appreciating that sharedness was a unique aspect of this program. We saw the use of the many special and rare images from the University of Minnesota Library's collections. We saw objects from the collection of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, which has an encyclopedic collection of art from around the world for most eras of human history. Although there are artworks from all over the Muslim world and by Muslims in many galleries, including the expanding contemporary collection, as well as artworks by European and American artists who explored artistic themes which they set in the Muslim world, there is a dedicated Islamic art gallery. In the program, Kathy Asher talked about a few of these objects, which was very fitting, as she is responsible for having influenced the MIA for creating the Islamic Art Gallery about 20 years ago, for which I'm very grateful as a volunteer guide at the MIA. I personally enjoyed my small role in helping present a little bit about how the cultural heritage of the Muslim world and some historical themes connected to it influenced local Minneapolis architecture in diverse ways. And there were other buildings that we filmed that didn't make it onto the program, but maybe there'll be other events where those can be explored. Interestingly, this whole process happened quite apart from any direct influence of an American Muslim community, and I hope that viewers will be stimulated to consider the implications of this. For me, it is about the international, even global perspective of cultural producers in earlier decades and centuries of American history who had learned about Muslim civilization as a part of world history. They had traveled extensively, were committed to continuing study, and they appreciated meetings with people of diverse backgrounds. They felt perfectly comfortable applying the knowledge they gained in their own very public work in our own local area to communicate complex ideas and themes about the humanities, such as the beauty of the arts, the achievements in science and technology, and concepts about society. In this segment, we were able to address something about making the global local in a way quite apart from the usual pragmatic justifications for diversity education and internationalization of learning, which are the demographic justification because of social changes in racial, ethnic, and religious makeup in our community, or the rising global importance of countries in Asia, Africa, Central and South America. These justifications certainly are important, but this program is about some other dimensions of connection between the local and the global. That it isn't something new, but has many fascinating precedents and even inspiring examples of local engagement with international thinking and application in the cultural life of our community. So now we are all expecting to do some community educational outreach activity with this program, and that could involve many of the above-mentioned types of organizations and institutions whose members and staff very much value the academic work taking place here at the U of M. I think we're all hoping that the program will extend the viewers' thinking about the topic of bridging cultures, Islam in the West, within the context of the humanities beyond pragmatism by extending their thinking to what meanings it might have for our own community. In this way, the program is intended to be a little bit eye-opening as well as thought-provoking, and ultimately to be encouraging of reflection, the desire to learn more, and considerations about what projects and policies might be developed from a humanities-based approach to academic and public engagement about Muslim civilizations in the West that focuses on sharedness.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Well said. With that, we do want to open it up for your comments on the program, questions, and just thoughts about internationalization and community engagement. So we have a question up in front, and we do have a mic coming around, or you can shout if you prefer.
Well, you really whetted my appetite for learning more about this area that I don't know a lot about. And one of the things that I think would be really fun if you haven't done it already is to offer a series of architectural tours of Islamic Minneapolis and St. Paul. I was just fascinated with in the film about the Suburban World Theater. So, but I'm sure there are other examples in the Twin Cities area.
There are actually many other examples. Do you want to talk about the others that you visited, or?
One of the very interesting ones was a synagogue in North Minneapolis, which was built in the 1920s and has a lot of Moorish architectural features. And I was a little bit disappointed that one didn't make it because it would have been cool, but I guess 27 minutes is 27 minutes. Maybe that's the 2 minutes that got cut. Yeah, it's now a church because, 70, 80 years ago, or I guess it's 90 now since it's 2012, North Minneapolis had a very large Jewish community, as probably many of you know, and, that sort of shifted over to St. Louis Park, and then in the 50s or so, became a more African-American community, and so now it is a church. Yes, it was, because exactly. It had a huge sign in the front that, on the building it said synagogue or temple, I can't quite remember, but it was really clear that it had originally been a synagogue, and then there's a big banner with the name of the church. So it was just fascinating. But there are other buildings that could be used, and other sort of examples of various kinds of Islamic architecture. In Stillwater, there's a historic house that was built as with many Moorish designs, Andalusian designs, and actually saw this on a TV program on HGTV a few years ago, and so I've been wanting to get over there sometime and see it for myself. There are tours of this place from time to time. So those are a few that come to mind, but there are buildings, like apartment buildings in South Minneapolis, that are built in the sort of Moorish style. I had a friend who lives in a building on Lagoon, just west of Hennepin, and there are quite a few buildings right there that are in the Moorish style. So they're
the Masonic Temple downtown on Hennepin. Yeah, the Masonic Temple downtown on Hennepin used to have onion domes on the four corners. Those are gone, but
yeah. So so these images are around, and I think they're at the Como Zoo. I think there's a building in the garden that actually below the roof there's a kind of Indian design there. Indian as in India, Indian. So it would be great to.
We'll consider that tour option.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning it. It gives us ideas.
Yes, hi. I just want to say good afternoon to everybody, and thank you again for your contributions to this presentation. I just had just one quick question. One of the presenters in the film briefly talked about hello, can you hear me?
A little better.
Is that better? Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you again and good afternoon. And I just had one quick question about one of the presenters in the film talked about Islamic art and how it supposedly ended around the 17th century. Do you have any idea why that presenter said that, or have any theories about why?
Yes, I think that what the presenter, whose name was Susan Babai, was making reference to is that, for example, traditional texts on the material will usually stop with the 17th century, for example, with something like the Taj Mahal or the great city of Isfahan, something like that. But what I was trying to say in my comments is that I think that's sort of old hat, and people have basically really moved on to think of much more contemporary material. But she's probably talking about the kind of training that she would have received when she was in graduate school, which pretty much did end things in the 17th century. But as I said, I think that's really very passé now.
Thank you.
Sure.
Throughout this whole process, were there any particular lessons that you learned about addressing a lay audience with this sort of scholarship?
How do we address a lay audience or a public audience?
Well, we're at the university, we kind of address the audience that we have, which is basically student and faculty, but in that particular occasion, we had a large amount of people attending from the community. And I think, we try to think in terms of presenting a multifaceted range of expressions. And, people have different interests, therefore, their response and reaction should be quite differently, engaged with those. So I don't know where to go. I mean, that's a good question. It's just that I think, we put it on the table, and in a sense we hope we can generate the kind of interest that goes beyond beyond the academic setup to the public, and then to see what kind of interaction we can get. But at that point, we just kind of started thinking about that, and we kind of continue to do that.
I was fascinated by it. I happened to be the one who started the graduate executive programs, and so I have 3,117 executives around the world in 45 countries, 32 of whom run hospitals of Saudi Arabia, 11 run the systems in Bahrain, and the ones who designed the Aga Khan Hospital in Karachi and Dar es Salaam and so forth. So I was intrigued with this in a certain sense, and I'm not an artist, obviously, but the part that fascinated me, and the Ismailis are the ones you were talking about, lots of them. I was surprised, or I was wondering if you include the kind of things that are Islamic that clearly are there that aren't what you would call art of the kind you demonstrated. For example, I'm proud that I have the face screen of the women who rode in Saudi Arabia. You know, the front. I'm ignorant. I don't know the name of it. But there are all kinds of those things that I considered artistic, that are clothing, that are the kind of things they had, the hookahs, the whatever else. And I didn't see that in the Islamic things here. And I was just curious if you were going to include that in what is Islam.
First of all, the coverage that was actually shown in the 27 or whatever minute film it was much less than we did in the initial coverage. And certainly if you go to the gallery of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts that is dubbed the Islamic Gallery, you will see, for example, hookahs and material like that. There were some kind of more or less, a hookah is basically a luxury art, and there were some that were just shown without labels, which I think is too bad that they didn't label them in there. But the Minneapolis Institute of Arts also has a very large textile collection, and none of which we actually were able to include in this particular version, but it does include the kind of material that you are talking about. So while I think they did a really good job in what they could cover in the material, it's meant to be kind of an eye-opener as opposed to a final word. And so there is much more available, and yes, many people have many definitions of art, but my personal one is that just about anything that you can put into the category of visual culture, I think equals art. So that's my personal opinion.
This is maybe a more philosophical question or a political question. Do you think a danger in conflating culture and religion, particularly when you're talking about a region of the world that is frequently seen as inherently fundamentalist? So talking about the Islamic world as if that region is concurrent with a specific religious faith, ignoring secularism or other faiths existing there?
You're right. I mean, there is clearly a generalization there that kind of is helpful in terms of geography to some extent, but clearly is inadequate. I mean, there's no question that the world now is so mixed and so interfused that there is no kind of Islamic world separate from the rest, and the rest is not there without, the Islamic world. I think we were trying to look at certain historical commonalities that would define a certain civilization or set of civilizations that emerged from the theological foundations of Islam. Now that, I think, is legitimate in the sense that, like all civilizations, at least within the monotheistic tradition, they start from texts, and then they interact, they grow, they enter cultures, languages, ethnicities, and then they develop and they become civilizations. And with Islam, it moves in, the Islamic tradition at least, and the foundations move geographically, east and west, and very early on. So there were kind of established civilizations from Spain to India that kind of identified their bases as foundationally Islamic, but developed their own identity and culture and expression. So that is, in a sense, how we would think about it in terms of foundational kind of concept. But clearly, I mean, yes, it's a world that is in motion. And to say that there is this kind of monolithic context is inadequate. I would agree completely. But it's convenient to use that. But as I say, also, if one looks foundationally, I mean, there is something that is foundational, as you would find in Christianity, as Judaism. And, if we speak on civilizations and link civilizations to that, foundational element of the text from which these three civilizations emerged, I think there is a legitimate kind of concept there. But it's not a complete one, exclusionary of others.
I would add to just a little bit also in the context of how the project was put together, one of the goals that came for the film that was a little different from the conference. The conference was more scholarly and addressed questions like that more than the film does. But as we were talking about the film in the very first time, one of the goals that we sort of kicked around and really got embedded in it was the fact that people in the U.S., particularly that would be the audience for this, don't know much about the things that we use every day that come from an Islamic world. And Nahid was really helpful. I mean, coffee is mentioned in the film. The term couch or couches. I mean, you had a whole list of things that oranges, right? Algebra, exactly. Yeah, and the term itself too, that we use every day that most of the world, many Americans are just not aware of. They think about Islam and they have that fundamentalist, stereotype in their mind. So we wanted to use this program as an opportunity to get discussion going, get some, as an eye opener, get some conversation out there.
Well, you raised a really good question. Where are you? Oh, there you are. Yes. Oh, thanks for raising it as well. Well, in my work, studying news coverage of Muslim people, mainly it's American Muslims rather than Muslims elsewhere in the world, and also in my sort of volunteer time as a guide at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, where I've been involved with a lot of continuing education programs for the other guides and docents. This type of question frequently comes up, and it's a good question about terminology and what it represents. And even now, people don't know the name of the religion, the name of the followers. They ask, what are the followers called? Islamics, Muslims, Muslims, Mohammedans. I mean, these issues are still around, and any kind of introduction has to address this basic issue of nomenclature because of the lack of knowledge amongst the general public. And then, now we have all these political science terms as well that add to the confusion, like Islamists, recent coinage to talk about people who have developed a kind of political ideology that, they argue is derived from Islam. That, of course, is debatable, but I won't go into that now. So, really good questions to ask. And, any kind of discussion ends up having to do some definitions to explain exactly what terms are we're using and why and what it includes, what it doesn't, a little background history. And so, we do have to address this, danger of, misunderstanding and misrepresentation and misapplication of terms that can really distort what it is that we're trying to talk about. So, good question. Thanks for raising it.
Thank you. This has been very interesting. You'd mentioned that the film in particular was about being a conversation starter. And I just wonder if you have any examples of kinds of conversations that have started as a result of this project.
Yeah, I have used it in a course, though, because I had the advanced copy. So I used a piece of it on architecture in the mosque in a course that worked extremely well with students, particularly in terms of looking at gender in the mosque. So it was a very good discussion that it got going. And we're getting the high sign that we need to end, correct? Okay, so I'm sorry we're going to have to put your question on hold. Feel free to come down. Thank you very much for joining us. Again, free copies of the DVD will be available in the next few weeks. If you'd like one, contact me at rels.umn.edu. And thank you very much for joining us. And thank you to our panelists as well.